All right. Now, over the weekend, it would have been obvious to you, particularly if you've been watching state-funded television or radio, that the pay equity issue is going to become an issue, I would think, obviously, into the election from now until the election. In fact, it'll be a big issue with the centre-left at the next election. The suggestion is that somehow women have been let down throughout New Zealand, or on one hand, and on the other hand, the suggestion is that billions, if not tens of billions of dollars, has been saved with no discernible increase in productivity as a consequence of spending those tens of billions of dollars. And it seems that that's how it breaks down. And also, if there really is such a thing as pay equity, as you know, I'm a cynic or a skeptic on that. But I would imagine most New Zealanders, if something's been taken away from you, you tend to get a bit antsy about it, and there were a number of people on the left who regarded pay equity, certainly the teacher unions, as going to be boosting their salary by a lot for no discernible increase in productivity or improvement in standards, I have to say. But that's not what upsets our last guest about what happened, our next guest about what happened last week to do with pay equity. It was to do with the use of parliamentary urgency. Now, having sat in a parliament myself and been through parliamentary urgency, parliamentary urgency is when you decide that, well, you're going to break the standard order, which is that a piece of legislation gets introduced, it gets sent to a select committee, submissions are then asked for the general public. They very rarely come from the public, they're mostly from interest groups. And then the select committee is meant to tidy up the legislation or to deal with issues that the legislation might have dealt with inadequately, make a report back to the House. The House decides whether or not it's going to agree with that or not. Actually, usually the Cabinet decides whether it's going to do that or not. And then as a result of that, the legislation is finally passed, and ta-da. It's quite a long process. God, it can last years, but I mean, usually it's a question of a year, actually, by the time something goes from go to woe. Urgency truncates that. It just goes, nope, we want to pass this. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a simple matter, usually for urgency issues. We're going to go through the House and we're not going to put it out for public submissions. We're not going to change our mind. And they go through the first reading, the second reading, the committee stages, and the third reading, and bang, it becomes. They're very good at that with parliamentary superannuation, I have to say. Go through in something like an hour. Nobody wants to, both sides agreeing to it. But on the others, our next guest, though, Bryce Edwards, says, well, the pay equity was an appalling example of parliamentary urgency being utilised. It will create serious problems. And Bryce Edwards, political lecturer at Victoria University, Dr. Bryce Edwards, Integrity Institute, joins us now. Bryce, welcome to the show. Love to have you on. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Michael.
How's the Integrity Institute going, first of all, and as a concept? Because it used to be, God, what was it, the Democracy Foundation? But then you changed it.
Yeah. So I've been working at Victoria University. There I set up the Democracy Project. That's pretty much dead now. I've retired that, and I've been involved in setting up a new think tank, if you like, the Integrity Institute. It's outside of the university, so nothing to do with Victoria University. And we're there to look at the political process and champion public participation and, I guess, challenge, scrutinise vested interests involved in political process.
No, I've seen it, and I think you send me your blog or your Substack every day or so, because I've obviously subscribed to it. Listen, the other thing I'm interested, though, is last week to do with pay equity. You've been very prominent, and I've seen you interviewed by State TV and I think State Radio as well, and others, about the fact that there was a dreadful process to go through last week. Why was it a dreadful process to go through last week to do with the pay equity legislation?
And so, well, I first just say that I'm not commenting on whether the changes were good ones or bad ones. I think there are good arguments for and against it, and I'm very keen on that debate happening. It's just that the debate has been truncated both publicly and in Parliament. And as you know, Michael, there's good ways of making laws and bad ways of making laws. Sometimes you do need urgency, and that's what happened in Parliament. The executive government put this amendment in on Tuesday. It was passed on Wednesday, all done and dusted. And, Parliament or governments should have the right to be able to do that, especially when it's necessary. If there's a natural disaster, a war, some fiscal crisis, sometimes they need to be able to do that. I'm not really someone that says that they should have that power taken away from them. But I think it was a sort of example whereby it wasn't necessary. They could have done this 6 months ago. They could have done this a year ago. And if they've left it too late, that's on them. I think there's a chance that what they've done will create less than optimal outcomes because it's been rushed and we haven't had a proper debate. Often it's the debates, the select committee process that actually helps those laws be sort of refined, and some of the fish hooks can be removed. And there's more chances of that kind of legislation being enduring if it's been properly well thought out and debated. That didn't happen.
I accept that, but on the other hand, it was a pretty simple thing to do. So they were getting rid of, because they realised that the process was not robust to deal with pay equity, number one. And number two, one would suggest that the fiscal costs were so open-ended and huge that they wanted to, in actual fact, reset pay equity. Now, they haven't got rid of it. They've just changed the process. And I guess there'll be legislation that will be introduced into the House, if not this year, then next, that will change what that pay equity legislation is. So given they'd made the decision, Bryce, to go, no, this is not working, this is not going to, and it had been changed by the previous government, so it wasn't the same system as had existed previous to 2020. Isn't that fair enough? Like, I'm just going to get rid of this now, and then I'm going to replace this with something else, and then the public can have an input into that.
Look, that might well be right, but it's certainly not ideal. The ideal scenario would have been that the three parties that went into this government would have campaigned on this at the last election and would have said, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, vote for us, and we'll have the mandate to do that. Then they would have come into government and said, okay, we're going to do this, and here's our plan, and we're going to go through a proper procedure and get it done. None of those things happened. And if you think back to a lot of the things that maybe you were involved in when you first came into Parliament back in, 1990, when you were a national MP, there were lots of things done there with great haste. And, they may have been the right things for that national government to do, but it caused a huge amount of upset, including, I think, probably from yourself, and it caused a lot of people to leave that government, either from the caucus or from supporting National, because, some of these things that changes, they didn't have a mandate for. And they didn't.
That's a different matter, though, isn't it? Whether you've got a mandate for something or not, and whether you do something under urgency or not, those are two different issues. Are you saying that if they had a mandate, urgency is okay?
I would say it makes it much better, yes. If they had gone, if they'd spoken before the election saying, look, we're going to get rid of this in our first 100 days, I think it would have a lot more credence. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
But it was totally unannounced. It was totally, I didn't see this coming.
It was left field. I agree.
It was left field. And other governments, just think about if other governments did this, if
other governments have done this.
Government, and they have, absolutely. And I don't think National's necessarily any worse than any Labour-led governments on this. Yeah. Every government seems to be worse than the previous one. And Labour, for example, just brought in, after 6 months or so in government, brought in the ban on oil drilling, on new permits for oil exploration. And that, again, came out of nowhere, and they just announced it one day. And again, I don't think that's a good way of making law and a good way of doing things. And so it is actually leading to a lot of public distrust in the parliamentary process and in government. You need to.
So you're assuming there was trust in the first place, Bryce. This is the curious part to me.
Good point. Yep.
No, I'm serious. I mean, I'm not being cynical here. I see, although, you're in the Beltway, you're in Wellington protesting about, the way in which the legislation's made, mate, I think that it's sort of the
Yeah.
horse bolted a long time ago on this issue, didn't it?
Oh,
Seriously?
look, maybe you're right. And I mean, the other thing that I wrote about in my column in the weekend about this was that I don't think the public's going to be particularly upset about the use of urgency. And that, if there's
No.
hand wringing from the likes of myself or constitutional scholars, it will have zilch impact, because I think there's a public appetite for politicians to get things done.
Correct.
The
Yeah.
zeitgeist is about action rather than constitutional or parliamentary process and niceties. So I kind of get that, and I think we have to be very careful not to look like we're talking about arcane and abstract things. So we have to understand that there's a lot of seemingly intractable problems in society at the moment, whether it's crime, whether it's climate change, the state of the health system, whatever. People want those things fixed. And I think when the government uses urgency like they have last week, I think most people will by and large say, good on them.
Yeah.
Let's get these things fixed. Let's not worry about any opposition. Let's plough through. And yeah, governments can do that. But if they do it too much, look, uh, you're coming back to this issue of trust. And has it already been lost? Yes, it is. But we're going to get to a situation where maybe we don't worry about elections. Maybe we,
I think, yeah, that's drawing a fairly long bow.
Okay, sure. But you see what's happening in other parts of the world where you're giving a lot of power to the incumbents to just,
Well,
do as they
see,
please.
I'm perhaps